activist groups have said, this gives China a lot of power over India and Bangladesh's water supply. I mean, some of the activists says, what's to say that China won't just turn off the taps on our water supply? I mean, these things aren't quite as simple as that, but it does give China a certain amount of control over that water supply. Well, we know that China loves dams and it loves hydroelectric power. It already has the world's largest hydroelectric scheme up and running on the Three Gorges. And now it's going to build an even bigger one. I mean, one that actually dwarfs that in terms of the amount of electricity it's due to produce, right high up in the Himalayas on the border between Tibet and India. I mean, it's literally about 20 miles from the border with India. It's on a river that's called in Tibetan the Yarlung Zampo, which is the river that we know better as the Brahmaputra, as it goes down through India and eventually joins the Ganges Delta and meets the sea in Bangladesh. It's just an enormous project, even by Chinese standards. It's going to cost about sort of well over 1 trillion Chinese yuan. That's about 125 billion pounds. That's several times the cost of the Three Gorges Dam. It's going to produce more electricity in theory than the entire British annual consumption every year. And so it's just a massive project, but it's also caused some concern, just the scale of it, the environmental effects of it, the possibility that it could trigger earthquakes. It's an earthquake sensitive zone. And of course, India and Bangladesh are very worried about the effect on the water supply downstream, which is always an issue for dams on rivers that cross borders.
Yeah, and the border between Bangladesh, India, and China has always been a bit of a tension point. How upset is India about the possibility of this dam being built, and why are they so worried about it?
Yes, it's a very interesting question. The central government in India have been relatively restrained about this. I mean, they've raised sort of formal concerns at sort of diplomatic level, but they haven't sort of spouted off in the media very much. Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, has been trying to sort of tone things down with China recently. They don't get on very well generally. They regard each other as rivals. They had, as you just mentioned, sort of border clashes right up in the Himalayas about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, which led to some deaths on either side in this sort of weird hand-to-hand combat right up in the sort of valleys of the Himalayas. Pretty extraordinary, and they've been trying to improve relations since. So India itself hasn't made much of it, but people in India have. So the local chief minister of the state of Arunachal Pradesh, which is the Indian state on the Indian side of the border, just there, he's expressed a lot of concern. He's pretty hostile to China anyway, because that state, that province, we might call it, China regards as sovereign territory of its own, and it disputes the way that the British essentially drew up the borders in that region, over 100 years ago. So they don't recognize him or his state. So he's hostile anyway to China. And a lot of environmental groups and other activist groups have said, this gives China a lot of power over India and Bangladesh's water supply. I mean, some of the activists says, what's to say that China won't just turn off the taps on our water supply? I mean, these things aren't quite as simple as that, but it does give China a certain amount of control over that water supply.
And what does this say about the wider India-China relations at the moment? You said they're not trying to get into a battle over this as such, but is there a point at which India might become more concerned about this at a nation level?
That's a very good question about these diplomatic conflicts. In places like the Middle East, we see these diplomatic conflicts give rise to fighting pretty quickly in an environment where there are already sort of military conflicts going on. In China and Asia, there's a huge incentive not to damage the fast economic growth of all the countries involved: India, Bangladesh, China, and indeed other neighbours with which China has disputes, including over water supplies and dams and rivers. There's a huge incentive to keep things civil in everybody's interest. So, I suspect that there won't be more any bite to go with the bark from the Indian side. Um, but these things do fester, and these resentments do sometimes fester in the future. I think for China, these projects are actually, part of their, if you like, their propaganda initiative. They like to show that they can do these massive projects and increase their energy supplies, particularly their green energy supplies. But India, of course, is also catching up on those fronts and learning from China about how to do mega projects itself. So there is a bit of a sort of irony and a contradiction in India's stance there, in that, for example, it's thinking about dams on the Brahmaputra itself. So, but it is particularly concerned. This one is such a big project and so close to the border that it is particularly sensitive. Yeah, well, at an economic level, just to answer that one, I mean, there is a fascinating debate going on in China, within China, but amongst economists who specialize in China, both Chinese and non-Chinese. And of course, it has political ramifications with the tariff dispute, the trade disputes with America at the moment, because, economies are all a sort of, complete organism, if you like. You can't really distinguish economically things like China's trade surpluses and the amount of money it puts into investment into infrastructure, which of course reduces the costs of its exporting industries. So there is a question: is China over investing? Should it be actually investing more money in increasing domestic consumption and importing goods from elsewhere to balance its trade surpluses? Its enormous trade surplus, $1 trillion a year, roughly, US dollars a year in overall trade surpluses, a quarter of that roughly with the United States, which, as we know, doesn't go down well with Mr. Trump. They would say, well, we are still a fast-growing economy. We need more energy. We need more electricity, and in particular, we want more green energy, because we are trying to meet our own climate change targets. We've agreed with the international community as well, and that requires moving from fossil fuels to hydropower and other renewable energy forms. Of course, they're also building. We have the world's biggest investment in coal-fired power stations. So the amount of energy they're adding to their grid every year is enormous. It is keeping their bills low, which we might envy, but it does mean that their exporting industries, which get cheap electricity, are uber competitive as a result.
And even within China, there's a sort of history of opposition that emerges in what is usually a pretty smoothly running command economy when it comes to large projects like dams, isn't there?
Yeah, so that is one interesting thing here. China does not allow much free debate on political issues, but there are some issues where it does allow a bit more debate, including on environmental issues, and including on issues that affect ordinary people's livelihoods. I mean, they've learned pretty well that if a village or a town is protesting against some new development, which is seeing houses demolished, it doesn't look good if they crack down on those protests too hard. So there is more of a tradition of debate about these things. The Three Gorges Dam, which opened in 2003, if I remember rightly, when it was being approved in the 1990s, it actually, I think if I remember rightly, about a third of the National People's Congress, the Chinese Parliament, which is normally very rubber stamp, just approves everything the Communist Party dictates. About a third of it voted against the dam because of environmental concerns and the scale of it and the number of people, the millions of people who were being displaced. and that was the biggest no vote in the history of the People's Republic. Um, and you know, the Three Gorges has been a sort of precedent, actually. There was a lot of concern about excessive dam building at the time, but that does seem to have worked. And some of the worst predictions, unless you believe, as some people do, that the dam triggered the Sichuan earthquake in 2008. But that's very hotly disputed. But other than that, it has produced a lot of electricity, and people have settled down and got used to it. So there's been less opposition inside China to this dam. Uh, but on the other hand, some academic experts are still holding out and saying we don't think this is a good idea. Again, pointing to the environmental consequences. The Tibetan plateau is a very fragile environment, and also pointing to the earthquake risk of having this enormous dam in an earthquake zone.
And Tibet itself is already a somewhat politically contested area. Is that going to add to the complications over this?
Well, yes. I mean, yes and no. I mean, one result of it being so politically contested is that it has a very heavy security presence. So, in some ways, it's also very remote, of course, but in some ways, that makes it easier for them. Given there can't be opposition to anything that the Communist Party dictates in Tibet, really, because it's so tightly controlled. Maybe that's another reason why we haven't seen much by the way of opposition to this dam. It does mean that the Tibetan movement in exile has expressed a lot of concerns about this dam too. The question is what influence they have with the Chinese government, and the answer is perhaps sadly to supporters of Tibet and the Dalai Lama, the answer is not much, really.
And it does sound like it is a somewhat controversial pick of where to build a dam. China's a large country. There are many other rivers in the country. Why here specifically for this dam, do you think?
Well, of course, China has a lot of rivers. It also has a lot of dams already on those rivers. This is, one of the last great untapped potential sources of energy, but it is a spectacular site for. It's a spectacular site, full stop. But it's also spectacular for if you're a hydro engineer. It's a canyon, this massive canyon right up in the mountains. The river descends about 2,000 meters in a very short space through this enormous canyon. So it is an absolute prime spot to build a hydroelectric power plant if you can get it right.
Well, Richard Spencer, the Times' China correspondent, thank you very much for speaking to me today.
That's a pleasure.